War of information. Doctrine and practice of communication influence Russian very used by organizations and institutions private to promote their image or destabilize a competitor using the lever opinion and reputation. Communication influence can also widely as applied to the framework state as a mode of action legitimate in peacetime, as in the context of the armed conflict, to impose its own matrix of international relations and defend its own interests. It is a question therefore sought to search for a domination informational effective on his opponent on the one hand, but also on states to sharing not necessarily against identical international relations and with interests perceived divergent on the other hand. It is preferable to use the term communication influence, rather than propaganda or disinformation, for the sake of objectivity and refuse any form designation normative footprint of a possible negative charge. The definition proposed by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, has the advantage to allow a large clarity in understanding targets Russians in terms of strategy influence. Described simply as a matrix tools and methods for goals of foreign policy without the use of force but through the use of information into their levers influence, these practices register so widely in the direct reaction used by the armed forces Russian as part, none of armed conflict 1. The work on the conflict Syrian, for example, the prism of the action Russian, the different actors and strategic aspects of geopolitical, are numerous, and a rich literature can clear delicacy apprehension of conflict. If the literature devoted to the communication influence Russian in the war Ukrainian remains, itself, enough developed, proposed by the place's production usual, think tank, cénacles university, and supplied by the press, par means of experts notamment, it turns virtually non-existent as part of the conflict Syrian. Gold, the same direct reaction is used by the Russian forces in the case Syrian and the diagram systemic seems to be able to identify. If campaigns influence are widely integrated in the strategic doctrine Russian, expression of a culture state and the historical tradition accustomed to control and orientation of public opinion, they remain largely ignored concepts strategic French, even if awareness seems to draw in the last white papers. These integrating issues influence digital to issues related to cyberdéfense. This lap may appear as relatively harmful. In fact, face a campaign influence requires operational capability counter-influence, which remains quite difficult, considering indeed that Russia can enjoy a large freedom on the internet and space as Western, which is far from being the case, vice versa. The objective of this article is to demonstrate that the communication influence Russian integrates in a strategic approach overall, exhaussant these methods as a practice legitimate, and in the case Syrian, to exemplify through a practical application, the foundation's practices the influence on the operational plan. The influence of the opinion, a mode of action integrated in the strategic doctrine Russian, a tradition old included in a matrix overall. The strategic doctrine Russian includes the war of information in the panel global equity intended to counter the opponent in since grid in a matrix overall and red in particular of the world onto the Russian Federation. The willingness to search for power and prevent domination informational is linked undoubtedly to some design propaganda, perceived here in approach practice and without any judgment ethics or moral, and exhaussée in scientific discipline and, as such, taught in most university centers and schools for the executive training military and civilian Russian. Because it since good in a comprehensive approach, and integral of the national security, methods influence in the pursuit of domination, informational should only and not perceive as acts conducted surreptitiously by a few activists supporting the regime scattered in that territory Russian, but rather like the fact a strategy supposed, justified and organized, with its entirety systemic. Julien, researcher to ifri, describes very precisely the phenomenon of reconciliation between the place's production traditional to know, as research centers universities specialized in matters of propaganda, and training centers senior diplomacy Russian, creating a culture of the influence to legitimize these practices with potential makers too. Its well-notioned central know-how, legacy of practice history, legitimized and deeply institutionalized, which explains today capacity and activity Russian in this area. The will weaken the system economic, political and social state just like research assumed of brainwashing populations are two aspects referred, the first arising out of the second three. Indeed, the elections in democratic countries represent major challenges and a legitimation legal needed to perform a liability policy. Influence on the grid writing that could have the opinion of international relations can, thus, in case of success notable the political influence conducted, require the politician to change its rhetoric election and, in case of election or re-election, be forced to conduct a different policy or alternative to that continued until now. Issues propaganda have been integrated to the strategic doctrine Russian. Use received methods influence could be seen, according to our categories, reading Western, as a form of hybrid warfare, being that the expression seems to have to be used with circumspection, theorized in the 2000s and integrated today in the corpus conceptual Western. It's so this what summary Valery Gerasimov, current Chief of Staff Armies the Russian Federation, in an article reference on the strategic doctrine Russian, claiming as well as the role of means non-military in order to achieve strategic objectives and political significantly increased, and in many cases, surpasses the effective interest of the armed force for. This multiplicity means implemented in optical operational is fundamental and involves using a wide range of methods, including all forces conventional unreported that NGOs supported by the power Russian or military vary, specialized in issues related to cyber-defensive awareness of gaps operational to the acquisition of expertise. This practice continues methods influence and subversion Sanskrit however, in a legacy delicate and difficult is passed deep in this area led to an awareness of the Russian authorities. Returns experience of the different conflicts in which Russia was engaged after the Cold War helped point weakness is obvious in the ability to offer a content positive to Western populations. The case of the second campaign Chechnya was in founder of the weakness capabilities counter-influence governmental counter the narration opposing scope by Western aggression Russian against fighters Chechens 0x6. War of Georgia in 2008, which made up the opinions public Western and specialists. Real operational capability Russian, was again a subject of controversy on skills counter-informational Russian and has led Kremlin to consider the creation of information troops, bringing together hackers, journalists, specialists in strategic communications and psychological operations and especially linguists. 7. Collecting all actors field cybernetics, this structuring and institutionalization progressive and armed Russian on issues influence reflects the will to promote a comprehensive approach issues of information, without focus on a particular angle. Quest to counter speech informational methods influence Russian applied on a case Syrian practice of the influence and theoretical framework. Compete with a media dominant in terms cognitive the quest influence. Russian uses the traditional methods applied field cyber. Strong connectivity Western populations, main target covered by methods influence of the Kremlin, invites logically Russians to use the framework digital for led campaigns influence. Several media really serve directly interests Russian and use rhetoric common elements language systemic intended to make visible on the one hand and support on the other hand, with an approach apparently neutral, the objectives and methods Russian. In this context, the selectivity of information is capital and invites not necessarily present information distorted, but more simply select them. The objective of any communication influence is switch between content apparently factual, intended to legitimize neutrality of a web platform, and critical elements are oriented to defend a course of action on. The web platform Sputnik News is thus a really influence Russian major and contributes, with its homologous Russia Today, to the constitution of content press on the web. Simply using the search engine internal site allows you to collect, in the case Syrian, the elements of language recurring and labeling of certain actors, but we develop thereafter. The need to produce a speech particular invites to consider the notion of influence on the web to ELL concept market proposed by the sociologist Gerald Bronner before we can perceive the web as a space where unfolds a multiplicity information possibly competition. For the power Russian, domination informational of the matrix Western in the war of information created a situational oligopolistic on this information market. It is a question to compete in offering a speech alternative and a new reading and presentation of events. In fact, we could easily consider that Russia tend, unoptimistically, to establish a quasi-monopoly cognitive on information by limitation enough liberticide of access to media and to the internet, while enjoying the liberalism of the West to compete with a media dominant on this market by content and speech alternative. Some considerations more technical seem, at this stage, necessary to specify. Operation even search engines general allows retain unconsciously a target. It frequents such subversion information also conscious adhering speeches and values worn by the power Russian or, for a bad controlled internet and ignorance damaging of operation, it is not known why the reality platforms visit is, encourages on the internet's moving ecosystem cyber where speech presses are dominant. In this sense, the results related to a query given change over time in order to ensure that these are the most possible match with the interests of the user. 9. The system rankage imposed by search engines fact that the user base, without make necessarily account, in the same ecosystem pseudo-media. On social networks, a strategy influence identical can also draw. It would be thus interesting, with software data to propose a view map on the social network to with particular accounts and profiles influencers. It is not purely speculative to consider that these elements would put the day several hundreds of profiles related to institutions Russian in taking shape think tanks, private, false profiles legitimated by elements symbolic, high level of education, post to be able, for relay information positive and content provided by the traditional media pro-Kremlins on the web. Example of a practical application. Blurred perceptions cognited by the designation process of the enemy. The scheme analysis suffers in reading simple and manichean events into specially different actors, substituent to the deep complexity of the real matrix binary. Because it drains with them all imaginary imbued with a profound negative charge and terrifying, especially in the current context where people French live in a universe mental imbued remembrance pregnant of tragic events. Paris and Nice. The term terrorist and very happy used to designate rebel forces and opposite plan Assad as a whole. Therefore, the use of such a rhetorical makes it possible to maintain a confusion between the different actors. An article dated November 10 last title in 6000 terrorist attack Aleppo Eastern evokes a close coordination between members of this terrorist group and other troops anti-government in other directions. 11. The next day, the same platform published an article titled Etching to Aleppo, Russia Evidence Incriminating Terrorists, Hermetinso Return Accusations Western brought against Bashar al-Assad. Finally, on November 12.